The mahogany doors of Bennett and Associates' real estate empire swung open one last time as they wheeled out the casket of Margaret Hayes, the woman who'd built an $80 billion company from nothing but grit and vision. Her son stood at the funeral, hollow-eyed and grieving, but his wife wasn't crying for his loss. She was calculating her exit. Within 48 hours of the burial, she'd thrown his belongings onto the rain-soaked driveway. Her new lover already warming the bed, his grief-shattered body had barely left cold, but she hadn't bothered to ask what his mother had left behind. The rich man she'd chosen, the one with the corner office and the Italian suits, worked for a company whose true ownership she'd never questioned, but the documents her husband's attorney delivered 1 week later carried a revelation that would turn her triumph into ash. What the abandoned son did next wouldn't just crush the woman who'd betrayed him in his darkest hour, but would shatter every dream she and her wealthy lover had built on the grave of his mother's memory. Could a man whose wife kicked him out at his lowest point reclaim not just his dignity, but the empire his real estate multi-billionaire mogul mother had secretly left him? Would the wife who'd traded grief for greed realize her mistake before her rich lover discovered he'd been working for the very man he'd helped destroy? And what kind of justice awaited those who'd mistaken kindness for weakness, inheritance for poverty, and a mourning son for a defeated fool? The rain hammered against the cathedral's stained glass windows like accusations from heaven, but Daniel Hayes barely heard it over the sound of his own heartbeat echoing in the emptiness his mother's death had carved into his chest. 600 people packed the pews, business titans, politicians, celebrities, but not one of them had known Margaret Hayes the way he had, the woman who'd read him bedtime stories between conference calls, who taught him that empire building meant nothing if you built it on the backs of people you'd forgotten to love. She was a visionary, the pastor droned, but Daniel's mind had drifted to that last afternoon in the hospital when his mother's grip had weakened around his fingers. "Danny," she'd whispered, her voice barely audible over the machines that couldn't save her, "I've made sure you're protected, everything I built, but you need to promise me something." He'd leaned closer, desperate for any words she had left, but she'd fallen unconscious before finishing. But those unfinished syllables haunted him now as they lowered her casket into the ground. Beside him, his wife, Jessica, stood with perfect posture, her black dress designer, her tears absent. But Daniel had been too consumed by grief to notice the way she'd been checking her phone throughout the ceremony. But the other mourners had noticed, but they'd said nothing, out of respect for the dead. The gathering after the funeral took place at the Hayes estate, a sprawling mansion overlooking the Pacific that Margaret had designed herself 30 years ago, when her company was still just a dream and a storefront. But the house felt like a mausoleum now. But Daniel wandered through it, accepting condolences he didn't hear, but Jessica had disappeared somewhere into the crowd. He found her in his mother's study, but she wasn't crying, but she was smiling at her phone. But the smile vanished when she saw him. "We need to talk," Jessica said, her voice carrying none of the warmth he'd fallen in love with 7 years ago, but he attributed it to stress, but he was wrong. "Not today," Daniel replied, exhaustion pulling at every word, but she'd clearly already made her decision. "Especially today," she countered, but her eyes were cold in a way he'd never seen before. But maybe he'd never looked closely enough. "Your mother's gone, Daniel, but we need to face reality now." Reality, but Daniel didn't know that reality for Jessica meant the text messages she'd been exchanging with Christopher Blake for the past 4 months. But Christopher Blake, who worked as Senior Vice President of Acquisitions at Bennett and Associates, but the very company Margaret Hayes had built from nothing. But Jessica didn't know that detail, but Christopher had never mentioned his employer's name. But he'd only talked about his salary, his prospects, his corner office with the view. "What reality?" Daniel asked, but he was still thinking about his mother's last words. But Jessica was already mentally packing. The reality that your mother kept you on the sidelines of her business your entire life, Jessica said, her voice gaining strength from the cruelty she'd been rehearsing for weeks. But Daniel flinched as if she'd struck him. You're 34 years old, but you've been living off her generosity. But now she's gone, but we need to figure out what that means for us. The words hit him like physical blows, but they weren't entirely untrue, but they were missing the context that Daniel had spent the last decade working in nonprofit housing development at his mother's suggestion, but building homes for families who'd been priced out of the market her company dominated. But Jessica had never cared about that work, but she'd tolerated it when Margaret's wealth cushioned their lifestyle. But now the cushion was gone in her mind. We'll figure it out, Daniel said, but his voice was barely a whisper. But Jessica heard the weakness in it, but it confirmed everything she'd already decided. No, she said firmly, but she was already standing, but she'd made her choice. I've figured it out, but you need to figure yourself out. But I can't wait around for you to become whoever you're supposed to be without her. The next 48 hours blurred together in a haze of grief and bureaucracy, but Daniel met with his mother's attorney, Marcus Winters, a stern man in his 60s who'd worked with Margaret since the beginning, but the meeting was scheduled for the following week to go through the will. But Daniel didn't press, but he assumed his mother had left him something to live on. But nothing more, but she'd always preached self-sufficiency. But he expected a modest inheritance and her blessing to make his own way. But Jessica didn't wait for the will reading, but on the second night after the funeral, Daniel returned from a meeting with the cemetery director about his mother's headstone to find his belongings scattered across the driveway, but his clothes soaked through from the rain that had started an hour earlier, but his books swollen with water, but his laptop case sitting in a puddle. Jessica stood in the doorway of the home they'd shared for 5 years, but her arms were crossed. But behind her, Daniel could see a man's jacket draped over the chair where Daniel usually sat. But the betrayal hit him harder than his mother's death, because he'd expected to lose her eventually. But Jessica's abandonment came without warning, but it came with calculation. You need to leave, Jessica said, but there was no apology in her voice, but there was only impatience. I've already changed the locks, but your name was never on the lease anyway. But this was always my apartment, but you've been living in my space. Jessica, what? Daniel started, but she cut him off. Christopher is moving in, she announced, but the name meant nothing to Daniel yet. But it would soon mean everything. He's successful, but he's going places. But he can provide the life I deserve. But you were always just your mother's charity case. But now the charity's run out. The man appeared behind her then, but Christopher Blake was tall, silver-haired, despite being only 40, but expensive cologne wafted from the doorway, but his smile was smug, but he'd clearly been waiting for his moment. No hard feelings, mate, Christopher said, with a British accent that Jessica clearly found sophisticated, but his hand rested possessively on Jessica's shoulder. She's made her choice. But you understand how these things go, but sometimes people outgrow each other, but it's just business, really. Just business, but Daniel would remember those words, but he'd turn them over in his mind during the 3 days he spent in a cheap motel on the edge of town. But he'd think about them as he stared at the water-stained ceiling and wondered how his life had collapsed so completely in less than a week. But the 4th day after his mother's funeral, Daniel sat in Marcus Winters' office, but the attorney's expression was unreadable as he laid out a stack of documents that seemed to grow taller with each passing moment. But Daniel barely had the energy to care, but he assumed this would be quick. But a small inheritance, some instructions, a final goodbye from his mother in legal language. Daniel, Marcus began, but his voice carried a weight that made Daniel look up from his exhausted stupor. Your mother left very specific instructions, but she was adamant that you not know the full extent of her plans until after her death. But she wanted you to have time to grieve the woman, not the wealth. I don't understand, Daniel said, but his mind was still half occupied with Jessica's betrayal. But he was wondering where he'd live, but how he'd rebuild. Marcus slid the first document across the desk, but it was a stock certificate, but the company name printed at the top made Daniel's breath catch. But Bennett and Associates Real Estate Empire, but beneath it, in stark legal language, complete transfer of ownership to Daniel Robert Hayes, effective immediately upon the death of Margaret Hayes. "This is a mistake," Daniel whispered, but his hands trembled as he picked up the certificate. But the numbers didn't make sense. But 100% ownership, but valued at $80 billion, but his mother's entire empire. "No mistake," Marcus said, but his stern expression softened into something almost like pride. "Your mother built this company over 4 decades, but she built it for you. But she always planned to leave it to you. But she kept you away from the business not because she didn't believe in you, but because she wanted you to develop your own values first. But she watched you build homes for people who needed them. But she saw you choose purpose over profit. But she knew you were ready." The room spun, but Daniel gripped the edge of the desk. But the implications crashed over him in waves. But $80 billion, but the largest real estate company on the West Coast. But properties in 17 countries, but 30,000 employees, but he'd inherited it all. "But Jessica said," Daniel started, but Marcus held up a hand. "Jessica was never privy to your mother's estate plans," Marcus interrupted, but his voice carried a hint of disdain. "Margaret was very deliberate about confidentiality, but she trusted very few people with this information. But Jessica wasn't one of them. But your mother had her reasons." Daniel thought back to family dinners where his mother would ask about his marriage, but her questions had always been pointed. "But is Jessica happy with your nonprofit work? But does she support your choices?" But Daniel had defended his wife, but he'd been blind. But his mother had seen what he couldn't. "There's more," Marcus continued, but he pulled out another document, but this one a comprehensive listing of company assets. But Daniel's eyes scanned down the page until they locked on a name in the personnel section: Christopher Blake, Senior Vice President of Acquisitions, Bennett and Associates, Real Estate Empire. The world stopped, but Daniel read the name again. But it couldn't be coincidence, but Christopher Blake, who'd been in his apartment, but wearing his smugness like armor. But the man Jessica had chosen, but he worked for Daniel's company, but he worked for Daniel. The Christopher Blake who... Daniel couldn't finish the sentence, but Marcus nodded grimly. "The same," Marcus confirmed, but he'd clearly done his research. "Your mother flagged him in her notes from 6 months ago, but she'd discovered he was having an affair with your wife. But she'd hired a private investigator, but she wanted to fire him immediately. But I advised her to wait, but to let things play out naturally. But she agreed only because she trusted you to handle it when the time came." His mother had known, but she'd known for 6 months. But she'd said nothing, but she'd carried that knowledge to her grave to spare him the pain while she was alive. But she'd also positioned him to handle it on his own terms. But she'd given him power, but the question was what he'd do with it. "What would you like to do, Mr. Hayes?" Marcus asked formally. But the question carried the weight of Daniel's entire future. Daniel sat in silence for a long moment, but images flashed through his mind. Jessica throwing his rain-soaked belongings onto the driveway, but Christopher's smug smile, but just business, really. But they'd both gambled that he was nothing without his mother. But they'd both bet on the wrong outcome, but they were about to discover just how wrong they'd been. "I want a full financial audit of Christopher Blake's department," Daniel said, but his voice was steady for the first time since his mother's death. But grief was still there, but it was hardening into something else now, but something purposeful. "I want to know every deal he's worked on, but every contract he's signed, but every expense he's claimed, but everything." Marcus smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile, but it was the smile of a man who'd been waiting for this moment. "Already done," he said. But he pulled out a thick folder, but the tab read, Blake, Christopher, Internal Investigation. Your mother started this investigation 4 months ago when she confirmed the affair, but she was thorough, but she found some interesting irregularities. Daniel opened the folder, but his hands were steadier now. But the grief was still there, but it was fuel now instead of weight. But the pages detailed a pattern of inflated expense reports, but kickbacks from contractors, but deals structured to benefit Christopher's personal investment portfolio, but nothing illegal enough to prosecute, but everything unethical enough to terminate, but millions of dollars in questionable transactions over a 5-year period. He's been stealing from the company, Daniel said, but it wasn't a question. Not technically, Marcus clarified, but his distaste was evident. He's been exploiting his position, but he's been padding his lifestyle at company expense. But your mother tolerated it because he was effective at acquisitions. But she planned to address it after she got through her treatment. But she ran out of time. But now Daniel had all the time in the world, but he also had all the power. But the question was how to use it. But revenge was tempting, but destruction was easy. But his mother had taught him something else. That power meant nothing if you used it like a blunt instrument. But real power required precision. But it required understanding what people valued most, then taking it away, piece by piece. Schedule a company-wide meeting, Daniel instructed. But he was already formulating a plan. But grief was transforming into strategy. All senior leadership, but I want to introduce myself as the new owner. But I want Christopher Blake front and center. The meeting took place 3 days later in the top-floor conference room of Bennett and Associates headquarters, but the building his mother had commissioned 20 years ago with the steel and glass exterior that reflected the sky. But Daniel had never been here before, but his mother had kept her professional and personal lives separate. But now they were merging in ways no one expected. 37 senior executives filled the room, but they were confused about this emergency meeting. But rumors had been swirling since Margaret Hayes' death about what would happen to the company, but speculation ranged from a sale to a management buyout. But nobody expected the quiet man who walked in wearing a simple black suit. But he looked nothing like a billionaire, but he looked like someone who'd been sleeping in a motel and grieving his mother. Christopher Blake sat near the head of the table, but he'd positioned himself there naturally, but assuming his seniority and his recent success would protect him during any transition. But he'd closed a major acquisition the week before Margaret's death. But he felt untouchable. But he didn't recognize Daniel at first. But why would he? But he'd only seen him once in a doorway. But he'd been too focused on his victory to pay attention. Marcus Winters entered first, but he commanded immediate attention. But everyone knew the attorney, but he was Margaret Hayes' most trusted advisor. But his presence meant official business. But then Daniel walked in behind him, but the room fell silent. Ladies and gentlemen, Marcus announced, but his voice carried authority that decades of legal practice had honed. I'd like to introduce Daniel Hayes, but he is the sole owner and CEO of Bennett and Associates, effective immediately, but in accordance with Margaret Hayes' will and final wishes. The shock rippled through the room like an earthquake, but executives who'd assumed they'd be fighting for control now realized they'd been outmaneuvered by a dead woman's long-term planning. But Christopher Blake's face drained of color, but recognition finally dawned. But the man from the doorway, but the man whose belongings he'd watched get thrown into the rain. But that man now owned everything, including Christopher's job, but including his future. Daniel took his seat at the head of the table, but the same seat his mother had occupied for 40 years. But the weight of it was enormous, but he channeled her memory for strength. But he thought about the woman who'd built this empire while raising him alone, but who'd never compromised her values even as she accumulated wealth that most people couldn't imagine. I know most of you don't know me, Daniel began, but his voice was quiet, but it carried. But grief had stripped away any pretense, but what remained was honest. My mother kept me separate from this company intentionally, but she wanted me to develop my own path. But I've spent the last 10 years building affordable housing, but working with families who've been displaced by the very market forces that made this company successful. But I'm not here to apologize for that work, but I'm here to bring those values into this organization. The executives exchanged glances, but they were trying to assess this new leader, but wondering if he'd destroy what Margaret had built. But Daniel let the tension build before continuing, but retention required pacing. But I'm not naive, Daniel continued, but his eyes scanned the room, but landing briefly on each face, but saving Christopher for last. I understand that this company operates in a competitive environment, but I understand that profit and purpose must coexist. But I also understand that my mother built this empire on trust and integrity, but she had zero tolerance for people who violated that trust. Christopher shifted in his seat, but his discomfort was visible now, but other executives were watching him. But some knew about the irregularities, but office politics meant most had stayed silent. But the changing of the guard meant old alliances were dissolving. Which brings me to my first order of business, Daniel said, but he nodded to Marcus, but the attorney distributed folders to everyone at the table, but thick folders that landed with ominous thuds. We're conducting a comprehensive review of all major acquisitions and expenditures from the past 5 years, but we're ensuring full compliance with company policy, but we're identifying areas where we can improve our ethical standards. Christopher opened his folder, but his hands trembled slightly, but inside was a detailed breakdown of every questionable transaction he'd made, but every inflated expense, but every corner he'd cut. But it was all there, but documented with the precision that Margaret Hayes had been famous for, but she'd been building this case for months, but she'd left it for her son to finish. Mr. Blake, Daniel said, but his voice was calm, but there was steel underneath. I'd like you to stay after this meeting, but we have some specific items to discuss regarding your department. The meeting continued for another hour, but Daniel outlined his vision for the company, but integration of affordable housing initiatives, but partnership with nonprofit organizations, but maintained profitability, but with consciousness about community impact. But the executives were skeptical but intrigued, but they'd serve whoever owned the company. But that's how corporate hierarchies worked. But as the room emptied, Christopher Blake remained seated, but his earlier confidence had evaporated. But he was calculating his options, but considering whether to resign before being fired, but wondering if he could negotiate. But Daniel watched him squirm, but there was no pleasure in it, but only a cold recognition of necessary action. You know about Jessica, Christopher said finally, but it wasn't a question, but it was an admission. I know everything, Daniel replied, but he gestured for Christopher to close the door. But this conversation needed to be private, but not for Christopher's dignity, but for Daniel's purposes. I know about the affair, but I know about the irregularities in your department. But I know that you've been treating this company like your personal bank account while sleeping with my wife in the home I provided. Christopher's jaw tightened, but he was trying to maintain some shred of defiance, but it was crumbling. You can't prove any impropriety, but everything I've done has been within the technical bounds of my contract. Technical bounds, Daniel repeated, but he almost laughed, but the absurdity of the phrase in light of everything. You're right, but you've been very careful, but nothing you've done is prosecutable, but that's not the same as ethical, but that's not the same as acceptable, but my mother knew that, but she taught me the difference between legal and right. So you're firing me, Christopher said, but he was already mentally calculating his severance, but his next job, but his exit strategy. No, Daniel said, but the word hung in the air, but Christopher looked up in confusion. I'm not firing you, but I'm restructuring your position, but you're being moved to a new role. This was the precision his mother had taught him, but the understanding that sometimes the worst punishment wasn't exile, but humiliation, But Christopher Blake had built his entire identity around his title, but his corner office, but his status within the company. But taking that away would hurt more than termination. "You're being reassigned to Field Property Inspector," Daniel continued, but he slid a new contract across the table, but the title was accompanied by a massive pay cut, but a loss of all benefits beyond the basic, but a position that would require Christopher to physically inspect properties, but to drive hours to remote locations, but to do the grunt work that entry-level employees typically handled. "You'll be responsible for assessing structural integrity of our low-income housing units, but you'll be working directly with the communities that have been impacted by the acquisitions you've overseen. But you'll be seeing firsthand the human cost of the deals you've made." "You can't do this," Christopher protested, but his voice was rising, but desperation was setting in. "I'll sue, but I'll go to the press, but You'll accept this position or I'll release the full audit of your financial irregularities to every major real estate firm on the West Coast." Daniel interrupted, but his voice was still calm, but the threat was real. "You won't be prosecuted, but you'll never work in this industry again, but your reputation will be destroyed. But every questionable deal will be public knowledge, but you'll be radioactive." The calculation was visible on Christopher's face, but he was weighing his options. But Field Property Inspector was humiliating, but it was employment, but it was survival, but the alternative was career death. But Daniel had given him a choice that wasn't really a choice, but that was the point. "Jessica," Christopher said finally, but it was a last-ditch effort, but an attempt to find leverage. "She'll never accept this, but she chose me because I was successful, but because I could provide, but if you do this, then she'll leave you," Daniel finished. But there was no emotion in his voice now, but he'd already processed this outcome. "But that's your problem, but not mine, but you chose to build your relationship on wealth and status. But now you'll discover what it's worth when those things disappear." Christopher signed the contract because he had no choice, but his hand shook, but his face was flushed with humiliation and rage. But Daniel felt nothing as he watched. But revenge was supposed to feel satisfying, but instead it just felt necessary, but like cleaning a wound. But the real confrontation was still coming, but Daniel had saved Jessica for last. But she deserved to understand the full scope of what she'd traded away. He found her 2 days later at an upscale restaurant where she was having lunch with 3 friends. But they were women Daniel recognized from their old social circle, but women who'd always seemed to measure worth by designer labels and vacation destinations. But Jessica was holding court, but clearly telling the story of her upgrade, but her escape from the man who'd been nothing without his mother. Daniel walked directly to her table, but he didn't ask permission, but he simply pulled out the empty chair. But Jessica's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Shock, but fear, but then forced contempt. "Daniel," she said, but her voice was artificially sweet, but her friends were watching with obvious curiosity. "I'm surprised you're even showing your face, but I heard you're staying at that motel on Fletcher Street. But how unfortunate." "Actually," Daniel said, but he was calm in a way that seemed to unnerve her, "I'm staying at the penthouse at Bennett Tower now, but it's one of the perks of being the owner." Jessica's smile faltered, but confusion crossed her face, but her friends leaned in, but they sensed a story developing. "Owner of what?" Jessica asked, but her voice had lost its confidence. "Bennett and Associates Real Estate Empire," Daniel replied, but he watched the color drain from her face. "My mother left me everything, but the entire company, but all $80 billion of it. But the company where Christopher works, but actually where Christopher used to work in the capacity he was hired for." The table went silent, but Jessica's friends were staring at her now, but the calculation was visible, but they were reassessing everything, but Jessica's mouth opened, but no sound came out. But she was trying to process the information, but her brain was short-circuiting. "That's not possible." she finally whispered, but her hands gripped the edge of the table. Your mother kept you away from the business, but you were never involved. But you couldn't. She kept me away so I could develop my own values, Daniel interrupted, but he was quoting his mother's letter that Marcus had given him. She wanted me to understand what mattered before I had access to unlimited resources, but she wanted me to choose purpose over profit, but she wanted to see if I'd build homes for people who needed them, even though I could have been living off her wealth, but I passed her test. But you failed yours. Jessica's face went from pale to flushed, but rage and humiliation were fighting for dominance, but her carefully constructed narrative was collapsing, but her friends were watching her with expressions that ranged from pity to schadenfreude. But everyone loves to watch a social climber fall. Christopher is successful, Jessica insisted, but it sounded desperate now, but she was clinging to her last defense. He's a senior vice president, but he's going places, but he's a field property inspector now, Daniel said. But he wasn't cruel about it, but he was just factual. He's been reassigned due to financial irregularities that my mother discovered before she died, but he's making about $60,000 a year now instead of $400,000. But he'll be spending his days inspecting foundation cracks in low-income housing units. But those are the places. One of Jessica's friends actually gasped, but another tried to hide a smile behind her wine glass, but the social implications were devastating. But Jessica had bet everything on Christopher's status, but she'd sacrificed her marriage for an upgrade that had turned into a catastrophic downgrade. But the math was brutal. You did this on purpose, Jessica said, but her voice was shaking now. But tears were forming, but they weren't tears of sadness, but of rage and recognition. You're punishing me, but you're destroying Christopher's career because I left you. No, Daniel corrected, but his voice was firm but not harsh. I'm holding Christopher accountable for behavior that violated company policy and ethics. But I'm doing what my mother would have done if she'd lived longer, but your affair was separate from his professional misconduct. But though I admit the two situations informed my timing. But you're taking everything from us, Jessica protested, but the us was telling, but she'd already unified herself with Christopher, but she'd made her choice permanent in her mind. I'm not taking anything that was legitimately yours, Daniel replied, but he stood up now, but this conversation was ending. Christopher still has a job, but he has to do it with integrity now. But you still have your choices, but you're free to stay with him. But build a life on his new salary, but prove that you valued him for something other than his paycheck. But this is your opportunity to show that substance matters to you. He turned to leave, but Jessica grabbed his arm. But her grip was desperate, but she was realizing the magnitude of her mistake. But the calculation was visible in her eyes, but she was already thinking about reconciliation, but whether she could undo what she'd done. Daniel, wait, she said, but her voice had changed, but the contempt was gone, but replaced by the softness she used to use when she wanted something. Maybe we were too hasty, but maybe we can talk about this. But you're different now, but I can see that, but we could. No, Daniel said, but he removed her hand gently but firmly, but there was no anger, but only finality. You made your choice when my mother died, but you showed me exactly who you are, but Christopher showed me who he is, but I'm grateful for the clarity, but you're both free to live with your decisions, but I'm free to live with mine. He walked out of the restaurant, but he could hear the explosive conversation starting behind him. But Jessica's friends were probably asking 1,000 questions, but the social fallout would be immediate and brutal, but gossip traveled fast in their circles. But by tomorrow, everyone would know that Jessica had left a billionaire for a field inspector, but the story would follow her forever. But as Daniel stepped into the California sunshine, he felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction, but not emptiness either, but something closer to peace. But his mother's lessons were finally making sense. But power wasn't about revenge, but it was about boundaries, but about consequences. but about ensuring that people faced the reality of their choices without shielding them from the outcomes. Over the following months, Daniel transformed Bennett and Associates from the inside, but he didn't destroy what his mother built, but he enhanced it with purpose. But 20% of all new acquisitions were directed toward affordable housing development. But the company partnered with nonprofits Daniel had worked with for years. But profitability remained strong because good business and good ethics weren't mutually exclusive. But Wall Street was initially skeptical, but results silenced critics. Christopher Blake continued his work as a field property inspector, but he showed up every day because the alternative was unemployment. But he inspected foundations and filed reports. But he drove hundreds of miles weekly to properties he'd once acquired without ever visiting. But Jessica left him after 3 months. But she'd tried to make it work, but his salary couldn't maintain her lifestyle. But she'd attempted to reconcile with Daniel twice, but he'd politely declined both times. But she eventually moved to another city, but disappeared from their social circle, but became a cautionary tale. Marcus Winters became Daniel's closest advisor, but the attorney had loved Margaret Hayes like a sister, but seeing her vision come to fruition through her son gave his later career meaning. But he taught Daniel the intricacies of corporate management, but how to be ruthless when necessary, but compassionate when possible, but how to honor his mother's legacy while building his own. But the hardest part wasn't the business transformation, but it was learning to live with the weight of his inheritance. But Daniel had nightmares where his mother appeared and asked if he was using her empire wisely. But he'd wake up uncertain, but questioning every decision, but wondering if he was honoring her or betraying her memory with his changes. He found some answers in her office, but Marcus had preserved it exactly as she'd left it. But Daniel went there when the pressure became too much. But he'd sit in her chair and feel the weight of what she'd carried. But one evening he discovered a letter she'd left in her desk drawer, but sealed with his name. But Marcus later admitted he'd known about it, but Margaret had made him promise to let Daniel find it naturally. "My dearest Danny," the letter began, but her handwriting was shaky from her illness, but still unmistakably hers. "If you're reading this, you've discovered the full extent of what I've left you, but more importantly, you've begun the work of making it your own. I kept you away from Bennett and Associates because I needed to know you could stand on your own, but I needed to see if you'd choose purpose when profit was easier, but you did. But you spent 10 years building homes for people who needed them instead of managing an empire that would have been yours regardless. But that choice told me everything I needed to know about the man you'd become. By now, you've probably dealt with the situation I discovered regarding Jessica and Christopher, but I'm sorry I couldn't spare you that pain, but I'm not sorry you had to face it. But strength comes from surviving what we think will destroy us, but you'll survive this because you're stronger than you know. Use this company for good, Danny, but don't be naive about it. But good business and good ethics can coexist. But only if you're willing to make hard decisions, but only if you're willing to hold people accountable. But only if you remember that power without principle is just tyranny in expensive clothes. I'm proud of you, but I've always been proud of you. But not because of what you'll achieve, but because of who you've chosen to be. But build something beautiful with what I've left you. But make me proud in heaven the way you made me proud in life. Love always, Mom. Daniel read the letter 17 times that night, but each reading revealed new layers. But his mother had known everything, but she'd orchestrated everything, but even her death had been part of a larger plan to prepare him. But the realization was overwhelming, but also liberating. But she'd believed in him enough to give him everything, but she'd trusted him to figure out what to do with it. 5 years after his mother's death, Bennett and Associates had become the industry leader in sustainable and ethical real estate development, but the company had built 40,000 units of affordable housing across 12 states, but profitability had increased by 18%, Because good PR and genuine mission attracted investors who wanted returns with responsibility. But Daniel had become a reluctant celebrity in business circles, but the billionaire who'd chosen purpose over profit, but the man who'd transformed grief into growth. He never married again, but he dated occasionally, but carefully. But he'd learned the cost of choosing partners who valued things over people. But he established the Margaret Hayes Foundation that funded housing initiatives globally, but he hired former nonprofit leaders into executive positions at Bennett and Associates. But he built a company culture that valued impact as much as income. Christopher Blake eventually resigned after 2 years as field property inspector, but the humiliation had been too much. But he moved to a different industry, but took a middle management position at a logistics company, but he never fully recovered his earlier status. But he'd learned that shortcuts and ethics violations eventually catch up, but the lesson had cost him everything he'd built. Jessica sent Daniel a letter on the 5th anniversary of his mother's death, but it was apologetic and reflective. But she'd gone back to school but become a social worker. But she claimed his rejection had forced her to examine her values. But she was working with homeless populations now, but she didn't ask for forgiveness or reconciliation. But she simply wanted him to know that their story had changed her. But Daniel never responded, but he didn't need to. But her transformation was its own conclusion. But the real measure of Daniel's success wasn't in the company's valuation or the units built, but it was in the lives changed, but the families housed, but the communities strengthened. But he walked through the developments his company had built and saw children playing in courtyards that wouldn't have existed without his mother's vision and his execution. But he saw elderly people sitting on porches they could actually afford. But he saw the concrete manifestation of values his mother had spent her life teaching him. On the 10th anniversary of Margaret Hayes' death, Daniel stood at her grave with Marcus Winters beside him. But they'd made this pilgrimage every year. But it had become their ritual, but their way of honoring the woman who'd shaped both their lives. She'd be proud, Marcus said simply. But the attorney was in his 70s now, but still sharp. But still serving as Daniel's advisor and friend. I hope so, Daniel replied, but he placed flowers on the marble headstone that read, Margaret Hayes, builder of empires, builder of character. She knew, Marcus said, but his voice was certain. She knew exactly what she was doing, but she knew you'd face challenges, but she knew you'd be hurt, but she knew you'd survive it all and become who you needed to be. But that's why she gave you everything. But because she knew you wouldn't let it corrupt you. Daniel thought about Jessica's betrayal, but Christopher's smugness, but the rain-soaked belongings on the driveway, but the moment he'd thought his life was ending, but all of it had been preparation, but all of it had been necessary. But his mother had known that comfort doesn't build character, but that challenge does, but that surviving your lowest moment shows you what you're actually made of. What happened to them doesn't haunt me anymore, Daniel said, but it was true. But the anger had faded years ago. They made choices based on what they valued, but I made choices based on what Mom taught me. But we all got the outcomes we earned. Marcus nodded, but they stood in silence for a few moments, but the California sun was setting behind them, but casting long shadows across the cemetery, but it was peaceful here. But the kind of peace that comes from resolution rather than revenge. She left one more thing, Marcus said finally, but he pulled out a final envelope, but this one sealed with wax and Margaret's ring imprint. She made me promise not to give you this until the 10th anniversary, but she wanted you to have a decade of experience before you read it. Daniel opened the envelope carefully, but inside was a single page, in his mother's handwriting, but the date showed she'd written it 2 days before her final hospital admission. Danny, if Marcus is giving you this, you've made it through 10 years of running the company, but you've survived the challenges I knew were coming, but you've proven that my faith in you was justified. Now comes the harder part, figuring out what comes next. But building empires is one thing, but sustaining them is another. But you'll face new challenges, but new betrayals, but new opportunities. But remember that every decision is a choice between who you were and who you're becoming. The company isn't your legacy, Danny, but your integrity is. But the buildings we construct will eventually crumble. But the values we live by echo in every life we touch. But that's the real inheritance I'm leaving you, but not the wealth, but the wisdom to use it well. Keep building, but keep growing, but keep choosing purpose over profit when they conflict. But keep being the man who'd build homes for strangers instead of mansions for himself. But that's who you are, but that's why you were ready for everything I left you. I love you beyond words, Mom. Daniel folded the letter carefully, but he'd read it many more times in the years to come. But for now, he simply stood at his mother's grave, with Marcus beside him. But two men shaped by one woman's vision, but two men carrying forward a legacy that was about more than money. Jessica's betrayal had crushed him, but it hadn't destroyed him. But Christopher's smugness had shattered his illusions, but it had clarified his values. But his mother's death had devastated him, but it had ultimately empowered him. But all the pain had been preparation, but all the challenges had been refinement. But he'd emerged from the fire stronger than he'd ever imagined possible. As they walked away from the grave, Daniel thought about the question his mother's hook had posed so many years ago in that hospital room. Danny, I've made sure you're protected, but everything I built, but you need to promise me something. He'd never heard what she wanted him to promise because she'd fallen unconscious, but he understood now that the promise was implicit in everything she'd left him. Promise to build something meaningful, but promise to hold people accountable, but promise to survive betrayal without becoming bitter, but promise to use power for purpose, but promise to honor not just her legacy, but the values that created it. Daniel had kept that promise, but he'd done more than survive what Jessica and Christopher had tried to do to him. But he'd transformed it into motivation, but he'd turned their betrayal into a catalyst for becoming exactly who his mother had always believed he could be. And somewhere, but he imagined her smiling, but not because he'd crushed the people who hurt him, but because he'd crushed the limitations they'd tried to impose on him. But he'd shattered their assumptions about who he was. But he'd proven that inheritance wasn't about money, but it was about character, but it was about choosing to build up rather than tear down, even when tearing down would have been easier. The sun set fully as Daniel drove away from the cemetery, but tomorrow he'd return to running an empire, but making decisions that affected thousands of lives, but building homes and communities, but carrying forward his mother's vision. But today he simply felt grateful, but grateful for the mother who'd prepared him, but grateful for the betrayals that had refined him, but grateful for the inheritance that had empowered him. But most of all, grateful that when Jessica had kicked him out at his lowest point, but when she'd chosen wealth over character, but she'd accidentally given him the greatest gift possible, the freedom to discover that he was strong enough to stand on his own, but wealthy enough to help others rise, but wise enough to know that real power comes not from crushing your enemies, but from building something so beautiful that their betrayal becomes irrelevant in the light of what you've created. The story of Daniel Hayes was ultimately not about revenge, but it was about redemption, but not his redemption because he'd never really fallen, but the redemption of values in a world that often seemed to value nothing, but the proof that choosing purpose over profit, but integrity over image, but character over convenience could still build empires, but could still change lives, but could still honor the memory of a mother who'd believed that her son could inherit not just her wealth, but her wisdom, but her strength, but her unshakable commitment to building something that mattered. And in the end, but after Jessica had been crushed by her own choices, but after Christopher had been shattered by his own corruption, but after the storms had passed and the dust had settled, but Daniel Hayes stood at the helm of an $80 billion empire his mother had built, but he'd transformed into something even she might not have imagined, but a company that proved profit and purpose could coexist, but that power and principles weren't enemies, but that the greatest inheritance wasn't money, but it was the courage to use that money to build something beautiful, but something lasting, but something that would echo long after the buildings crumbled and the bank accounts emptied, but something that would stand as testament to the truth that character, not capital, is the only currency that truly matters in the end. 20 years after Margaret Hayes was laid to rest, Daniel stood in the lobby of the newest Bennett & Associates development, but this one was different from all the others. But this one carried a weight that transcended architecture and urban planning. But this one was personal in ways that made his throat tight with emotion. He'd learned to control, but never fully suppress. The Margaret Hayes Memorial Housing Complex stretched across 12 city blocks in the heart of Los Angeles. But it wasn't just affordable housing, but it was a complete ecosystem. Childcare centers, but medical clinics, but job training facilities, but community gardens, but art studios, but everything his mother had believed people needed to not just survive, but thrive. But the crown jewel was the central tower that bore her name in letters that caught the sunset and turned gold. "Dad, they're ready for you," a voice said behind him. But Daniel turned to see his daughter Maya, but she was 22 now, but graduating from architecture school next month. But she'd designed parts of this complex as her senior thesis. But she'd never met her grandmother, but she'd inherited Margaret's eyes and her determination. Daniel had married again 8 years after his mother's death, but he'd met Rachel at a housing nonprofit fundraiser. But she was a civil engineer who'd spent a decade building water systems in developing countries, but she'd loved him for his values before she ever knew about his wealth. But they'd built something real together, but something that had produced 2 children who understood that privilege came with responsibility. "How many people are out there?" Daniel asked, but he was nervous in a way he rarely was anymore. But public speaking had become routine after 2 decades, but today felt different. "About 5,000, Maya replied, but she adjusted his tie the way her mother always did. But the gesture made him smile. "Mom's in the front row with Jacob, but Marcus is there too, but he insisted on coming even though the doctor said he should rest." Marcus Winters was 89 now, but he'd officially retired 5 years ago. But he'd never really stopped advising Daniel, but they spoke weekly. But the attorney had become the grandfather figure Maya and her younger brother Jacob had never had. But Margaret's death had created a bond between the 2 men that transcended business. But Marcus had promised to attend this opening because he'd been there at the beginning, but he wanted to see how the story ended. Daniel walked to the stage that had been erected in the central courtyard, but 5,000 faces looked up at him, but they were residents who'd been selected through lottery from over 50,000 applications, but families who'd been living in cars or shelters or overcrowded apartments, but single mothers and elderly couples and young people trying to build lives in a city that had priced them out, but veterans and teachers and service workers who kept the city running but couldn't afford to live in it. But these were the people his mother had built her empire thinking about. But these were the people Daniel had spent 20 years serving. Rachel sat in the front row holding Jacob's hand, but their son was 16 and already taller than Daniel. But he wanted to be a doctor, but he volunteered at free clinics on weekends. But the apple hadn't fallen far from any tree in this family. But Marcus sat beside them in a wheelchair. But his body was failing, but his mind was sharp. But he caught Daniel's eye and nodded. But the gesture said everything. "She'd be proud, but you've done it. But you've honored her." 20 years ago, Daniel began, but his voice carried across the courtyard through speakers, but 5,000 people fell silent. "I stood at my mother's grave and made a promise I didn't fully understand. But I promised to build something meaningful. But I promised to honor her legacy not with monuments, but with meaning. But I promised that every decision I made would pass a simple test. Would this make someone's life better?" He paused, but he looked around at the buildings that surrounded them, but 10 residential towers with over 3,000 units, but rents set at 30% of income regardless of what that income was, but subsidized by the commercial developments Bennett and Associates built elsewhere, but cross-subsidization his mother had pioneered, but Daniel had perfected, but the math worked because they'd made it work. This complex represents the culmination of that promise, Daniel continued, but his eyes found a woman in the third row, but she was holding a toddler. But she was crying silently, but he understood why. But he remembered what it felt like to have nowhere to go but to have your belongings thrown into the rain. But it's not my achievement, but it's the achievement of every person who believed that housing is a human right. But that dignity shouldn't depend on your bank account, but that we can build communities that don't just shelter people, but empower them. The applause started small but built like a wave. But 5,000 people were standing now. But some were crying, but they'd won a lottery that would change their lives. But their children would grow up in safe homes with access to opportunities that had been denied to their parents. But generational poverty could be broken. But Daniel's mother had believed that. But she'd built an empire proving it. But now her son was expanding that proof. But as the applause continued, Daniel's mind drifted to another person who should have been here. But Jessica had reached out 6 months ago through a mutual acquaintance. But she'd heard about the opening, but she'd asked if she could attend. But Daniel had politely declined, but not out of spite, but out of recognition that some chapters needed to stay closed. But she'd made her choices. But he'd made his. But their paths had diverged permanently. He'd heard through the grapevine that Jessica had actually followed through on her social work career, but she was working with domestic violence survivors in Portland, but she'd never remarried, but she'd built a small, quiet life that bore no resemblance to the status-obsessed existence she'd led during their marriage. But Daniel hoped she'd found peace, but he no longer needed to know, but forgiveness didn't require reconciliation, but you could wish someone well without wanting them in your life. Christopher Blake had died 3 years ago, but Daniel had learned about it through an obituary, but a heart attack at 57. But he'd never recovered professionally from his fall, but he'd spent his final years in obscurity. But Daniel had felt sadness when he'd heard, but not satisfaction. But Christopher's punishment had been living with himself, but understanding what he'd lost through his own choices. But that was consequence enough. My mother built an empire, Daniel said, bringing his focus back to the present, but to the people who were here now, but to the future being created in this moment. But she always said that empires mean nothing if they're built on the backs of people you've forgotten to value. But she taught me that wealth is only meaningful if it creates opportunity for others. But she believed that business could be a force for good without sacrificing excellence. But everything you see here is proof that she was right. Maya was watching him from the side of the stage, but her expression was intense. But she was studying him the way architecture students study buildings, but looking for the load-bearing elements, but the structures that made everything else possible. But Daniel realized she was learning not just from his words, but from his example, but the way Margaret had taught him. But legacy wasn't what you left behind, but it was what you built into the people who came after you. But I also want to acknowledge the people who aren't here, Daniel said, but his voice dropped slightly, but this part was harder. The people whose choices led them away from this moment, but because this project exists partially because of them. But their betrayal taught me that character is tested not when things are easy, but when everything falls apart. But being abandoned at my lowest point showed me that I was stronger than I knew. But losing everything made me realize what actually mattered. Rachel was crying now, but she'd heard this story many times, but it still moved her. But she understood that Daniel's first marriage had been the crucible that forged the man she'd fallen in love with. But sometimes destruction was necessary before construction could begin. But Jessica had unknowingly given Daniel a gift by leaving, but she'd cleared the space for him to become who he was always meant to be. So to everyone here, today, Daniel concluded, But he was speaking to the residents now, but not to cameras or press, but to the actual people whose lives would unfold in these buildings. Welcome home, but not just to an apartment, but to a community that believes in you, but that wants to see you succeed, but that understands that everyone deserves a foundation to build their dreams on. But my mother built this company on that belief, but I've spent 20 years trying to honor it. But now you'll spend your lives proving that when we invest in people, but when we create opportunity, but when we choose purpose over profit, but everybody wins. The applause was deafening now, but 5,000 voices were cheering, but children were running through the courtyard, but families were holding each other, but Marcus was wiping his eyes, but Rachel and the kids were standing, but Maya was beaming with pride that made Daniel's heart ache. But this was what his mother had died believing in. But this was the inheritance that mattered. After the ceremony, Daniel found Marcus in a quiet corner of the courtyard, but the old attorney was looking up at the tower that bore Margaret's name, but the sunset was painting it gold and orange, but it looked almost ethereal. She would have loved this, Marcus said softly, but his voice was weaker than it used to be, but age was catching up with him. Not just the building, but what it represents. But you've taken what she started and made it better. But you've proven that her vision wasn't naive, but it was just ahead of its time. I couldn't have done it without you, Daniel replied, but it was true. But Marcus had been his guide through every challenge, but every crisis, but every moment when the easy path diverged from the right path. You would have found a way, Marcus said. But he turned to look at Daniel with eyes that had seen 4 decades of business evolution. You're like her in the ways that matter, but you're also your own person. But you took her ruthlessness and tempered it with compassion. But you took her vision and expanded it. But you've built something that will outlast both of you. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, but the sounds of celebration continued around them. But families were touring their new homes. But children were discovering the playgrounds, but elderly residents were settling onto benches in gardens that had been designed for community. But life was happening in real time. But this wasn't theoretical anymore, but these weren't plans or proposals, but this was reality. I never thanked Jessica, Daniel said suddenly, but the thought had been forming for years, but he'd never articulated it. If she hadn't left, but if she hadn't shown me who she really was, but I might have stayed in that comfortable mediocrity, but I might never have found Rachel, but I might never have pushed myself to do this. Marcus chuckled, but it turned into a cough, but Daniel handed him water, but when he recovered, he said, Your mother knew that too, but she told me once that she was almost grateful for Jessica's superficiality, but because it meant you'd be free to find someone worthy of you. But she orchestrated a lot of things, but she couldn't orchestrate that, but the universe handled it for her. Do you think she knew how it would all turn out? Daniel asked, but he'd wondered this for 20 years. No, Marcus replied thoughtfully, but he was still looking at the tower. She knew who you were, but she didn't know exactly what you'd do with it. But that's the difference between controlling and trusting. But she trusted you to figure it out. But that's the real inheritance. But not the money, but the trust that you'd use it well. Maya approached them then, but she had Jacob with her. But both of Daniel's children looked at Marcus with the reverence usually reserved for historical figures, but to them he was living history, but the last direct link to their grandmother. Marcus, Maya said gently, but she knelt beside his wheelchair. I wanted to show you something before we leave. But I incorporated one of Grandma's original design principles in the community center, but the way she used natural light to create gathering spaces. But I studied her early projects and found this technique she used in the first building she ever designed. Marcus's eyes lit up, but Maya pulled out her tablet, but she showed him the architectural plans, but she pointed out the details, but the old man studied them with an attention that defied his physical frailty. But finally, he nodded. She would have loved that you're carrying this forward, Marcus said, but his voice was thick with emotion. She built buildings, but you're building on her ideas, but that's legacy, but that's immortality, but not your name on a building, but your vision in the people who come after you. Jacob, who'd been quiet, suddenly spoke up, but his teenage voice was serious beyond his years. Dad, but when I'm a doctor, but I want to work in clinics like the one here, but I want to serve communities like this, but is that okay? Daniel felt his eyes burning, but 20 years of emotional control nearly shattered. But his son was choosing purpose over profit before profit was even an option. But the values were passing to the third generation, but his mother's legacy was alive in children who'd never met her. More than okay, Daniel managed to say, but he pulled Jacob into a hug. That's everything, but that's exactly what Grandma Margaret would have wanted. But you're carrying forward something bigger than any of us. As the sun set fully, the Hayes family and Marcus sat together in the courtyard, but 5,000 people were settling into their new homes around them. But lives were changing in real time. But children were claiming bedrooms, but families were cooking first meals in kitchens they could actually afford. But elderly people were settling into safe spaces where they could age with dignity. But this was the compound interest of compassion, but Margaret's initial investment of values was multiplying across generations and communities. Rachel joined them, but she sat beside Daniel, but her hand found his automatically. But they'd been married 12 years, but they still moved like newlyweds. But she'd been there through the challenges of building this project, but the setbacks and the victories. But she believed in the mission as much as he did. I heard from the foundation, Rachel said quietly, but she directed this to Marcus. The Margaret Hayes Scholarship Program has now put over 10,000 students through college, but many of them are coming back to work for Bennett and Associates. But we're creating a pipeline of leaders who understand that business should serve communities. Marcus nodded but said nothing, but tears were running down his weathered face. But he'd spent 40 years helping Margaret build an empire, but another 20 helping Daniel transform it. But now he was seeing the fruits of that labor multiply beyond anything they'd imagined. I'm tired, Marcus said finally, but it wasn't a complaint, but it was a statement of completion. But I'm satisfied, but I've seen what I needed to see, but your mother's vision has become reality, but Daniel's made it better than she dreamed, but the kids are carrying it forward, but my work is done. The weight of those words settled over them, but everyone understood what Marcus was saying. But he was saying goodbye, but he was giving them permission to continue without him. But he was releasing his guardianship of Margaret's legacy because it was in safe hands now. 3 months later, Marcus Winters died peacefully in his sleep, but his funeral was held at the same cathedral where they'd mourned Margaret Hayes 20 years earlier. But Daniel gave the eulogy, but he talked about loyalty and wisdom and the quiet way Marcus had shaped 2 generations of Hayes leadership. But at the burial, they laid him to rest 3 plots away from Margaret, but close enough that the 2 old friends could continue their conversation in whatever came next. But life continued at the Margaret Hayes Memorial Housing Complex, but success stories emerged daily. A single mother who'd been living in her car got stable housing and found a job in the community center, but her daughter made honor roll for the first time because she had a quiet place to study. But an elderly veteran who'd been sleeping in shelters finally had an apartment where his grandchildren could visit. But a young couple who'd been priced out of the city could now afford to live near their jobs and start planning a family. But these weren't statistics, but these were lives being rebuilt, but dreams being realized, but dignity being restored. Daniel visited the complex once a month, but he'd walk through the corridors and courtyards. But he'd talk to residents and staff, but he'd see children playing in spaces his daughter had designed. But he'd watch elderly people tending gardens his wife's engineering had made possible. But he'd observe young people using job training facilities his son would someday serve through medical care. But the ecosystem was working, but the vision was alive. On the first anniversary of the complex's opening, Daniel stood again at his mother's grave, but this time Maya and Jacob were with him. But Rachel stood beside him, but they'd made this a family tradition. But teaching the children that gratitude required presence, but that honoring the dead meant living well. "Grandma," Maya said, but she was talking to the headstone as if Margaret could hear. "Dad says you would have loved what we built, but I think you already knew we'd do it. But your vision is still changing lives, but I promise to keep building on it." Jacob added, but his voice was deeper now at 17. "I start volunteering at the clinic next week, but I'm going to help people the way you helped people, but by giving them what they need to build their own futures." Daniel said nothing, but he didn't need to, but his children were saying everything that needed to be said. But legacy wasn't about words, but it was about actions multiplied across time and people. As they walked back to the car, Daniel's phone buzzed, but it was a message from the foundation. Another major donor had committed $50 million to expand the model to 3 more cities, but the Margaret Hayes approach to integrated affordable housing was being recognized as the industry standard. But what had started as one woman's vision was becoming a movement. "Dad," Maya said as they drove home, "I've been thinking about my thesis project, but what if we designed a complex specifically for aging populations, but integrated with young families so there's natural community support, but Grandma's model but adapted for multi-generational living?" Daniel glanced at his daughter in the rearview mirror, but she had Margaret's eyes and Margaret's mind. But the vision was evolving, but the next generation was already innovating on the foundation. "Let's do it," Daniel said, but he was smiling, but grief had finally transformed completely into gratitude. But 20 years of building on his mother's legacy had taught him that the best way to honor the dead was to expand on their dreams, but to take what they'd started and make it better, but to prove that their sacrifice and vision hadn't been in vain. That night, Daniel sat in his home office, but the same office where he'd first learned about his inheritance 20 years ago. But he pulled out his mother's letters, but he'd read them hundreds of times, but they still revealed new truths. But he found the last one, but the one she'd written 2 days before her final hospital admission. "The company isn't your legacy, Danny, but your integrity is," he read again. But the words had become his mantra, but his guiding principle through 2 decades of decisions. He thought about Jessica, but she was a distant memory now. But her betrayal had been the catalyst for everything that came after. But sometimes the worst moments create the best outcomes, but he hoped she'd found peace in her own way. He thought about Christopher, but dead now for 3 years, but his punishment had been living with his choices, but understanding what he'd lost. But Daniel felt no satisfaction in that, but only a quiet sadness that someone had chosen so poorly. But mostly he thought about his mother, but about Margaret Hayes, who'd built an $80 billion empire and used it to prove that business could be a force for good, but who'd raised a son to value character over capital, but who'd orchestrated her legacy so precisely that even her death became a teaching moment, but who'd trusted that Daniel would figure out how to honor her memory not by preserving what she'd built, but by transforming it into something even better. The Margaret Hayes Memorial Housing Complex was just the beginning, but Daniel had 15 more projects in development across 8 states. But the model was being studied by urban planners globally, but Fortune 500 companies were adopting the integrated approach. But Bennett and Associates had proven that ethical business wasn't just possible but profitable, but more importantly, it was meaningful. 20 years after his wife kicked him out, but 20 years after he inherited an $80 billion company, but 20 years after he crushed the dreams of those who'd betrayed him not through revenge, but through success. But Daniel Hayes sat in his office and felt something he hadn't felt since before his mother's death. Complete peace, but not because everything was perfect, but because everything had purpose, but because every decision he'd made had been guided by values that transcended wealth, but because the inheritance he'd received wasn't money but wisdom, but and wisdom properly invested always yields returns that compound across generations. Outside his window, the city lights spread out like stars, but each light represented lives being lived, but dreams being pursued, but futures being built. But somewhere in that constellation were 5,000 families sleeping safely in the Margaret Hayes Memorial Housing Complex. But tomorrow they'd wake up and continue building their lives on the foundation his mother had envisioned and he'd constructed. And that, but Daniel understood as he turned off the office light, but was the only legacy that mattered, but the only inheritance worth passing on, but the only measure of success that would survive. When the buildings crumbled and the bank accounts emptied and the names on towers faded into history, did you use what you were given to make life better for people who came after you? But did you choose purpose over profit when they conflicted? But did you prove that character and commerce could coexist? But did you honor those who believed in you by becoming someone worth believing in? His mother had done that, but Marcus had done that, but now Daniel was doing that, and his children would do that, but the chain was unbroken, but the vision was alive, but the legacy was secure, but not in buildings or bank accounts, but in values passed down, but in lives changed, but in the quiet revolution of people who believed that the world could be better and then did the hard work of making it so. Jessica had kicked him out thinking she was trading up, but she'd actually freed him to trade up in ways she'd never imagined. But not to a richer partner, but to a richer purpose, but not to a bigger house, but to a bigger mission, but not to more comfort, but to more meaning. And somewhere, but Daniel believed, but his mother was smiling, but not because he'd crushed his enemies, but because he'd built something so beautiful that their betrayal had become irrelevant, but just another forgotten moment in a much larger story, but a story that was still being written, but still unfolding, but still proving every day that the greatest inheritance isn't what you leave behind, but what you build into the people who carry your vision forward long after you're gone. The weight of legacy. But Daniel understood finally, but wasn't burdened, but it was wings, but it was permission to fly higher because someone else had built the runway, but it was the gift of knowing that your life had meaning, because you'd been given a foundation to build on, and you'd built something worth standing on for those who came next. And that was enough, but that was everything, but that was the inheritance that mattered, but the only story worth telling, but the only legacy worth leaving, but the proof that a real estate multi-billionaire mogul named Margaret Hayes had lived and died well, and that her son had honored her not by preserving her empire, but by transforming it into something that would change lives long after both of them were dust, but long after the buildings fell, but long after the money was spent, but long after every word of this story was forgotten, but the values would remain, but compound across generations, but echo in lives not yet lived, but proving finally and forever that the greatest revenge isn't crushing those who hurt you, but building something so meaningful that their betrayal becomes just a footnote in a much larger story of purpose, but impact, but legacy that transcends the merely personal and becomes universal, but becoming proof that how you handle your lowest moment determines the height of your eventual triumph. And with that understanding, but Daniel Hayes, but son of Margaret Hayes, but father of Maya and Jacob Hayes, but builder of empires and communities and legacies that mattered, but closed his eyes and rested. But his work incomplete, but his purpose clear, but his mother's vision alive and multiplying, but her memory honored not in mourning, but in building, but in growing, but in becoming everything she'd believed he could be, and then surpassing even her wildest dreams.